But your question on shipping and logistics, at the moment there are legal restrictions that prevent ownership beyond 40% of those companies to foreign nationals, and the fact of the matter is that shipping is a global business. And under the area of reform that we'll discuss a little later in the question sector, perhaps we can bring that up. The buzz, dirty word today is taxes, and so I'll switch on to that topic, and I'd like to address this to Mrs. Sanjay Bandar from CA Sri Lanka. In my chat with you earlier on, sir, you voiced the opinion that quite apart from your membership being itself adversely affected by the current tax structure, you are the custodians of the financial performance and financial planning of the companies and businesses that you all work in. And you mentioned that you were struggling with, that your membership was struggling with having to make business look viable in these circumstances. What are your major concerns, and what specific questions would you have that you need clarity on in this regard, in the area of the taxation policy of this country? And I'm talking of tax policy of this country.
Yeah, on that, my question goes to Dr. Samaratunga and Mr. Sirivardhana. As per the recently released IMF report, Sri Lanka is expecting to have a 15% tax to GDP by 2026. At the moment, it is around 8.2%. And last year, we had a contraction in the economy around 8.5%, and this year, we're expecting a contraction around 3%. And next year, we are expecting a growth around 1 plus, 2024, 2 plus, sorry, 2025, 2 plus, 2026, 3 plus. In that context, contribution to tax to GDP of 15% from GDP growth rate is going to be not that significant. Does it mean that, we will continue with the current tax system and the rates for another 4 years? Is my first question. The second question is whether government intend in introducing new taxes within next 2 to 3 years, because the corporate world require this information for their planning purpose. And I would request Dr. Harshadi Silva and Mr. Mantira and Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe also to share their observations on their comments. Thank
you. Perhaps, Doctor, if you can take the question first.
Our taxation system worked very well when we were really poor. In 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. The tax to GDP ratio was above 20% when we were really poor. But when we crossed the border of the middle income country, the relative significance of taxation to GDP has gone down, over the last nearly 3 decades or so, from mid-1990s. Apparently, the government of those days may not have, the thought of, the significance of keeping up with, the certain level of revenue to run a government. Now, we are in a negative territory. As you rightly say, we are in a recession. The economy has contracted by 7.8% last year, and another 3, probably this year. And even if you, cross zero, the positives may not be, that big enough to, raise, the revenue. But, your denominator is, the smaller now. Therefore, if you have to bring about, the 15% or above, of course, it's difficult. But there is no other way other than, the raising revenue to meet, the essential government expenditure, because, the situation, the conditions and the circumstances are such that, there won't be, you cannot, afford to continue with, the mismanaged economy anymore. Therefore, we have to be rigid, but certainly, to answer your question, that we have, the additional taxation or new tax. I would say that, we have, Sri Lanka has lost large quantum of revenue outside the taxation system. Honorable President continued to keep us telling, all the time, probably, the last 6 to 8 months, there is a system of revenue which government has not, properly looked at for the last so many years. We don't have, the system of collecting those revenue, which we have ignored for about from mid-1970s. We had a good system of revenue collection system from, from the village level all the way up to, the governor, British governor during the British regime. But, somehow in the early 1970s with the taxation reform, we made the Inland Revenue an independent exclusive body for the collection of revenue. But there are large amount of, the revenue, non-tax revenue, which remains, the uncollected and, the not looked at properly by anybody in this country. There is no, the people who can, share information at the village level or above with the income tax department. Income tax department is centrally located in districts and, in the center. But during the good olden days, that we have, the village headmans, we have, the divisional revenue officers. We have abandoned that part completely. Therefore, the large amount of non-tax revenue remains in the economy uncollected. That is the area probably, we may want to, look at seriously in raising, the additional revenue to meet, this 15%. Of course, in the taxation sector, it's obvious, and also, all the time, we are blamed, the government is blamed for not collecting revenue from those individuals and companies and, the entities which should definitely pay, the taxes. There is, the major administrative lacuna in the system as well. But probably we need, the additional laws to, catch them as well. And the other measure probably, we want to reactivate, augment, and, the deepen is, the electronic methods, using electronic methods to collect, the tax based on existing legislation. With those ones, probably, and since the denominator is, the small, we may not be able to, the far off from 15% by, the 2026, 2027. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, just to add what Dr. Samaratunga mentioned is that, yes, you're right. Because last year, in nominal terms, we saw about 37% increase in revenue, total revenue. It's about close to 500 billion. Even though we had this 7.8% contraction in the economy. That was also supported by the policy measures that we implemented and also the efforts made by the revenue agencies, particularly in the revenue department. But this year it's going to be different. We have a little high target in terms of revenue, and economy contraction is going to be lower, but at the same time, the inflation impact will also be lower this time. According to central bank's expectation, we would be basically, seeing some single-digit level inflation towards this end of this year. So if that is the case, then as you correctly mentioned, this inflationary impact would not be there as we experienced last year, but there will be partly, it will be affecting as well. But then the question is, how you get this lost or revenue out there into the government coffers is the key issue. So then we have already implemented the policy measures. Then the next step would be to strengthen the tax administration. We are a country which had about maybe sometimes more than 22% of revenue in the past, about maybe 2-3 decades ago. But as a result of these concessions, complexities in the tax administration, weaknesses in the tax administration, all sort of things have affected to the total revenue collection, and it has now come to around 8.2% of GDP. In fact, it was the case in 2021. It remained the same, almost same in 2022 as well, despite the effort that we took. Then how we get into the 15% of revenue target within maybe 3-4 years is the question, as you very correctly indicated. Then we will have to go through all these exemptions. If you go through the IMF report, they have specifically mentioned that some of the exemptions will have to be very carefully removed. And then the tax administration will have to be implemented, particularly use of IT systems. We have to reduce or remove the human intervention and human touch. And then you have to improve the use of this new electronic and other IT-based solution and system. We have given emphasis to that. We already have had discussions, a number of discussions with the Inland Revenue Department and other revenue collecting agencies, how we basically use this as a tool to get many people into the tax net, and then at one point we would be able to reduce the high tax rates going forward. And it has to be come as a result of broadening of the base. So those are the kind of areas that we have to touch if you are to get this revenue going forward during next maybe 3 to 4 years.
Thank you, gentlemen. Your answers focused in the main on the tax collection mechanism and the increasing of the tax net, which is certainly an important and relevant factor. On the question of the tax policy itself in terms of the existing tax structure, I mean, we hear, for instance, of the reintroduction of the inheritance tax in the pipeline. Now, these are all matters of concern to people out here in the audience. We already are taxed substantially on income. We have huge levels of indirect taxation on every product that you buy. Is this tax structure going to continue into the next few years? If so, for how many years? And what new taxes can we expect in the next few years as well? I believe this will be critical for organizational business planning, for personal planning as well. So, Mr. Deshaltimel, would you like to handle that and give us some idea on this?
Sure. So I think it's important, first of all, to focus on core taxes so that you don't have a plethora of measures that add complexity to an already difficult business environment, right? So when I say core taxes, I mean corporate and personal income taxes, VAT, and co-excise. Co-excise means excise on tobacco, alcohol, petroleum, and so on. So those would be do the heavy lifting in terms of tax collection. Now, beyond that, of course, Sri Lanka is in a situation where we need to have a fairly steep revenue enhancement in a relatively short period of time, especially in the context of where we are asking our global counterparties, be they the IMF or our external creditors, we are asking our external creditors to take losses on the loans that they have extended to Sri Lanka. So in that sense, we also need to demonstrate a material fiscal effort from our side to make it ensure that they are also willing to participate in this process of reducing our debt. So that is where, in addition to these core taxes, we also require some further measures. Those measures need to be progressive. When I say progressive, what I mean is measures where the tax burden is shouldered by the wealthy, those who can afford it, as opposed to indirect taxes where the burden falls disproportionately on the poor. So in this context, that is where they are exploring measures which have been captured as wealth taxes. Now, this is, because these are new measures, they require a degree of analysis, a degree of work before they are rolled out. And that process will commence now in terms of identifying what type of taxes are appropriate in this context. How are those taxes? How do they strike the balance between generating revenue whilst avoiding disincentivizing the deployment of capital? Because that's an important trade-off that we have to take in mind, and that requires a bit of runway in terms of analysis, in terms of research to get that across. So that process is going on now. That is why we have left it until 2025. For these measures to be introduced. So the idea is where you're ensuring that any new measures are progressive and strike that appropriate balance.
Can I say a few words on inheritance taxes? In this country, we had wealth tax and estate duty. Until about 1987 or so, I have paid wealth tax. When my father passed away, we had to pay estate duty. What we decided was, by 1977, the whole capital base, which was built up, as I said, from 1850 onwards, was destroyed. There was nothing left. Houses were taken over, estates were taken over. And to build up the capital base, the first issue that President Jayawardena did was he took on these big construction projects. Mahavali allowed many of the Sri Lankans to come back into the as businessmen with capital, whether it was subcontractors or subcontractors to subcontractors, whether it supplied goods. But the total of Mahavali and the Kotte capital project was to give back capital. Secondly, we felt that we could accelerate it with the war going on if we suspended inheritance tax and estate duty for some time. Well, it got suspended, but it was never introduced again. And now, as the IMF says, a capital formation has come into being now. It's very, very big. We have a big capital formation here. We have others outside Sri Lanka. So when you're looking at progressive taxation, they said you could bring this back. If you want to know what high-level taxes are, how about paying ordinary people paying 60% of the tax? And then if we had anything left over more than 2,500, which was a lot in those days, minister's salary was about 1,000 rupees. We had 2,500 left. Anything more than 2,500, it was put into basically compulsory savings. I used to work for Mr. Ambalavan, and we had a thriving practice telling people how to avoid paying this to the ceiling on taxes. So we've come a long way, and I think with all the issues, our taxes are certainly more progressive than it was early.
Would you be still consulting, sir?
Well, looking at the gentleman here, if you are willing to pay on the side, I'll have to do it. What else? I have paid very little as president. This is the only way to add to my remuneration.
The Honorable Era Murata and Mrs. Honorable Mrs. Samani.
Just on this imposition of wealth tax, I don't know why the imposition has been postponed. I'm asking this question because while we are told that there will be wealth tax and it will come someday, the poor have been forced to pay taxes in various forms because this is an indication of the disparity. See, everybody knows that we have to pay more taxes. There's no question about that. But in taxation, there has to be a very strict yardstick on fairness. So that fairness index is still not achieved, I think, and that's an area to look at. Last budget cycle, when the budget debates were going on, Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe, myself and a few others, publicly proposed a different tax structure that doesn't impact on the poor. Now, we did a public, demonstration of how that can be achieved and so on. Doesn't seem to have been taken on board. Now, I'm saying that also because I agree with the President that all of us have to do this together. And the discussion must happen here, not on the streets. But if the discussion is not to happen on the streets, then it must happen here. It must, already in this forum, Harsha had a half a minute say, and now I'm put my hand up and I'm saying something, right? So if this is a forum where the government just explains and goes away, then it's not a robust discussion at all, and it won't achieve that particular objective that we discuss openly, transparently, and go together. I also agree with the President that the ethnic issue, as he mentioned, must be resolved. And you can't say we'll do it after the economic crisis is over. No, it won't happen in that way. It's intrinsically connected. As we speak, we have a massive public protest going on in Batticaloa. We have another massive public protest going on in Mana, and even bigger protest happening in Vaunia. How many of us even know that it is happening? So, the archaeology department is running amok, right? and I just looked at the logo of the archaeology department. It's a Dagaba and the Dharma Chakra. Now, is that the only archaeology relevant to this country? Right? So the fairness question and the public support, particularly to pull us out of a difficult economic situation, you must have the support of everybody, and that's not just only economical support. It's a perception and an understanding that everybody is being treated equally and fairly. And that is severely lacking, and we are willing to participate in these discussions. If we know there are suggestions and our views will be taken on board. And all of those would be constructive suggestions, I can assure you.
In fact,
And I, okay.
yes,
Far as I am concerned, I have said Sri Lanka's economic question has two E's. Both have to be resolved. Our first priority was getting the IMF agreement. But in the meantime, there were parallel discussions with the representatives of the Tamil from the north and the east. And we have come to agreements now which we will start working on just after Sinhala New Year holidays are over to implement it. I know the one in Vaunia is about the destruction of the temple. That's one which you've asked the police to investigate. And secondly, archaeology, we had one meeting in Vaunia, we had one meeting here, but there are still problems with archaeology, and there are other problems with forest department, which applies both to the north and to the north central province and Monaragala. So we will be looking at those issues next week. In addition, now we want to start on system B. Part of it would be for the companies that are looking for land to export food to Singapore and as well as Middle East. The rest will go to the people of Eastern Province. And that will be fairly substantial. Then there are the other issues which we will be resolving in time to come.
thank you, Mr. President. Honorable Mr. Sumandiran, in fact, that was going to be a question of mine as to the reaction of the North and East, in your view, to the tax proposals and the level of cooperation that can be expected from it. But you've already addressed a bulk of that on the concept of the perception of fairness being a key player in the acceptance of proposals of this nature. Is there anything further you wish to comment on before I hand over to the Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe for his observation?
Just one matter, as the President said, we're having discussions together, and I only hope that we move forward in that without postponing those reforms as well. We've also had discussions with regard to how the North and East can contribute towards the economic growth, because there is a high level of potential there. So we've looked at special development funds, different kinds of investments coming in, all of that. And we will cooperate with the government with regard to realizing all of that, because, as was mentioned by you and others at the beginning of this discussion, IMF bailout package and thereafter the borrowings will only make us more into debt, take us more into debt. For growth to happen, there has to be a plan that sort of pulls us out of this, of this mess. And for that, investments are key. And there is great potential if we target certain areas and have and address those issues. That's one. The other is the corruption susceptibilities was one of those concerns that IMF mentioned. Now, the President mentioned regaining Sri Lanka effort. But, during that time, there were two privatized ventures that were reversed. Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation and Lanka Marine Services Limited. I was counsel for Mr. Vasudeva Nanayakara in both those cases. Because there were those two cases, those were reversed. How many more went unaddressed? Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation, the asset was valued at 6 billion when it was in fact more than 125 billion. So you start on this process. I agree with the president, the state can't do business, but you start divesting, the huge opening for corruption.
I'm coming into the SOE question.
Can I tell you on that? Firstly, for North, we are coming up with a big development plan for North, and North will be the biggest beneficiary of green hydrogen. I think that will really catch up and North will be able to catch up on many of the other provinces. So is the East with development of Trincomalee and the tourism. The other one will be the NCP, again with its potential for modernized agriculture. As far as insurance was concerned, it was transparent. And we sold it. Now we took it back. If you ask the chairman insurance, the company could have got far more in insurance. Now I think you have lost Ronald, you have lost your lead in some of the sectors. So, okay, we've got to decide at the end of the day, are we going ahead or not? There's no fraud. It was a question of valuation. This will come again in this instance. So we've got to either make up our mind. Are we going to privatize or not? That's what we have to do. If the courts want to interfere, then the courts must find the money. That's all I can say.
I will come on to the question, sir, on SOE. Just as you say, the privatization is necessary. I think it is the process that is in question. The process and the transparency, accountability and transparency in that process, that is the matter in issue here. Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe, would you like to comment specifically on the tax matter before we move on to the matter of government expenditure and SOEs?
I won't want to specifically comment on the tax matter, I must say that. And the reason is, this is IMF and beyond. And in the president's speech, he said, rather than looking at all the little details, I think being a preliminary discussion, it's better to talk about the big issues. I have been critical on details, not on the principle, even on tax. And the reason for that is, economics and finance cannot be looked independent of the socio-political reality. This is a country which has had violence every 25, 30 years, and there have been cycles, and therefore we need to have a buy-in, so with protection of the poor and taxation. So I won't get into the details of that. But the government has taken progressive measures, independence of the central bank, the law has come into parliament, and I would say that, of course, it should go back to more like the 2019 draft of it, and the amendments should be moved in parliament. Uninterrupted fuel and energy, Kanchana minister has been doing things. Later in the media that Ruwan Wijewardena has been having discussions, post-COP27, I presume, sustainable energy, absolute must, foreign investment, absolute must. Some people are trying to thwart it because the cost cannot be brought down in any other way, and we want to see that happen. SOE reforms just referred to, transparency, absolute must, regulation has to be strengthened. These are the two basically pillars for SOEs. I won't get into the details of that either. Education, select committee in parliament, trying to build a consensus among parliamentarians. The system must be opened. This nonsense of keeping a closed system won't work. 28 foreign students in all Sri Lankan universities registered in 2022. Malaysia had 50,000. So let's all get together. This has to be absolutely changed. And then I would say there has been an office set up for overseas Sri Lankans. It's a welcome move. Overseas Sri Lankans are the biggest asset this country has. Education, investment, skills. And we have to actually bring them back here. And this is something we all can actually get together, and that office has been set up. I think we need to look at it. I would like to just make 3 quick suggestions, because I listened carefully to Sherrod. The issue for government is building confidence. Confidence is a major issue. The rest of it, we should leave it to the private sector and to the community rather than the government trying to say what to do and so forth. In that, I would say one of the suggestions is, going beyond tax, is really looking at a unified fiscal authority. So you have customs, excise, inland revenue all coming. Some things you have to do in 6 months, as the officials have been showing, some in 2 years, some will take 5 years, but we have to start now. And that will help in many ways. One is the number of taxpayers, the net will increase, revenue will increase. I'm not going into the details that the secretary referred to. And also corruption will reduce, because your interaction with the customs and so forth and so on will come down, because they take care of clearing, unified authority gets the revenue. Case studies are there of other countries, how they have got that. I would say we need to think, because this said IMF and beyond, I'm not thinking of the IMF program, I'm thinking way beyond that and saying this something needs to be done. The second thing I would say is public sector reform. In the last period with the IMF, we did fiscal consolidation based on revenue. I'm saying we have to look at cost as well. I'm looking at public confidence. The public are saying we are paying taxes, what's happening with our taxes, see all the inefficiencies, the service levels we get, etc., etc. We need to look at that. Therefore, there are things that we don't discuss, even in this round with the IMF. I don't know what the internal discussions were, but the expenditure side, defense expenditures, one of the highest in Asia, nearly 10%. India is 9%. All of the Asian countries are less than 5%. We have to absolutely look at public sector reform on the expenditure side. And finally, I would say this. Again, I'm talking about public confidence, right? People are concerned. Investors locally and overseas, businessmen are concerned about the levels of corruption in this country. It's basically at every level corruption is there. And therefore, we need to deal with it. And I'm saying up front, there is a conflict of interest here. You're a minister, you're advised by the Attorney General's department. You rob, they have to prosecute you. Cases have been put, cases have been withdrawn. And there are decades of experience in this. And therefore, we need to be radical, like countries like Hong Kong. And we need to look at not just bringing the law, because I know the President, Mr. Vijaydas Rajapaksa, have agreed to bring in the law, laws have been drafted, but we need an independent public prosecutor who will actually go after this. And the reason I'm putting these suggestions, I'm looking beyond the IMF agreement. We need to build long-term confidence so that this country's direction will not be reversed.
Can I say a few words? I've enjoyed being here, but I've got to now attend another function. But this is called the dialogue. So I think let the dialogue begin. I think the officials, I must say in fairness to them, have explained how the system is working. And we have opened it out, the IMF program, for discussions with everyone. And certainly when we are revising it once every 6 months, there's more space for discussion. But we'd like everyone to be involved in the growth strategy, which will be presented thereafter. So I will leave it to the compeer to ensure that there is certainly there's a dialogue going on, and I'd entrust Foreign Minister Ali Sabri to lead the government side. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We thank His Excellency for the time this morning to engage in this dialogue. Before we move into the area of government expenditure, which is the next subject that I would like to cover in this, and there are a lot of questions from the audience already on this that I have received. Ms. Anuji De Silva, you work with the Women's Chamber, and a lot of your work is with entrepreneurs, startups in the rural sector and things. Is there any impact of the tax law on them? And if not, what is the most pressing issue that they face from an economic perspective? Unfortunately, we don't have enough women representation on this panel, for sure, and that doesn't augur very well for what the the Honorable President stated earlier in his address about gender equality and gender representation. But over to you, tell us.
Yes, so I think despite being given a seat in the opposition, I think we all owe our gratitude to the President because he's taken the country at a very difficult time, and he's actually delivered the promise of getting IMF to sign with us, which I think is a huge achievement. And like he said, it's up to us now as citizens of this country to put the country first and actually to contribute to get us out of this situation. So we do deal with a lot of the micro level people, and one of the biggest problems they have is not tax. It's the confusion that they are in trying to understand what has happened to this country. Because they don't understand, they just listen to what different people say and they are completely confused. So just to take the liberty to explain, we explain it to them in a very simple manner. We take this analogy of a family that suddenly finds itself that maybe the trusted husband has run through all the money of your family and you're bankrupt. And in a situation like that, what we tell them is, okay, your initial instinct is to figure out how you can increase the income of your family. You're not going to waste time complaining about being disruptive. You're going to focus on how to increase the income of your family, plus how to reduce the expenditure, because that's the only way for you to survive. You can go to maybe a few relatives, like what you do with the IMF, to get a short-term facility, but you have to pay that back. And unless you do this, you cannot get out of it. So by saying that, what we are trying to do actually is to put them in the right mind space, because the people of this country are very confused at the moment. They don't really understand, and I would like to request the government ministers, we need to have a campaign to approach these simple people and to explain to them the situation we are in, because otherwise they're thoroughly confused. And the next step that we do is actually the biggest problem they have is the debt trap they have got into. Because when the interest rates were very good, they went and borrowed at 7% without realizing some of those are also variable interest rates. And now they can't manage the debt they are in. So that's actually the biggest problem they have, not tax. So that has to be something also the government has to help them to get out. And the third is really the ease of doing business, because the SME sector is a contributor to this country. They are not a burden to the country. They contribute the largest GDP to this country, largest number of employment, but they get very little assistance for the ease of doing business. I mean, I'm in the process of writing to Minister Kanchana to help one of our entrepreneurs who's waiting for 4 years to get bulk electricity because of a petition her electorate had sent, and she's about to relocate to Dubai. So this is how we lose our exceptional entrepreneurs. So Adam, I think just to say these are the real issues the SME sector face. Tax is something that they are not thinking about at the moment.
Thank you, Anuji, for enlightening us on that segment. It's a segment that's often missed and very valuable input indeed. Moving on to government expenditure, transparency and financial accountability. The flip side of being taxed is that we suddenly wake up and we want to know that our tax money is working, and we take a greater interest in this aspect. And so, once again, this is a matter that's very much in the limelight. The IMF staff level report has this to say: risks to program implementation are exceptionally high, given the complex debt restructuring process, unfavorable external environment, elevated risks of persistently high inflation, and challenging political and social situation. Given Sri Lanka's weak track record of reform implementation, the program runs significant risks of slippages regarding financial consolidation, revenue mobilization, and reserves build-up. I think that is a fabulous summary of where we stand. Sagarata says where we stood. Let us see whether we have actually moved on from there. We have not seen, and the state has not communicated to us any plan or target for the reduction of government expenditure and any process of how that will be achieved. And I believe, really, while work seems to be happening, part of the problem is the lack of communication of what is happening. Anuji, you mentioned that at an SME level, and I think that is true to say of the entirety of the populace here. What steps are being taken to reduce government expenditure? Concrete steps. To reduce the employee count in the state sector. Reduction of sectors like, for instance, the armed forces. After the end of the war, we saw an increase in the armed forces cadre rather than a reduction, notwithstanding reports to the contrary by many of the commissions that were appointed for that purpose. And what is the timeline or the plan for this? If someone from the state, Honorable Ali Sabri, if you wouldn't mind leading that on or directing it to someone who can take that question, and then we'd like to hear from the business sector as well.
Mr. Ratnayaka on the defense and then the...
Okay. Speaking specifically on the defense side, you said the numbers increased. It's not that the numbers increased, but a right-sizing program didn't kick in. So we've started discussing that. There's been an automatic right-sizing program that has commenced. It's not an intentional one. Government recruitment stopped, which went across the board to the three forces and the police. I don't say that's a good thing, because there will be certain gaps in skill when that happens. But also there have been depreciation, automatic depreciation. We have about 2,500 soldiers going out of the system on a monthly basis. That's been taking place, and those have brought the numbers down, but that doesn't answer your question. Are we going into a conscious program? Yes, we are designing the program right now. We've started the discussion with the three forces, but more importantly, we are working out our defense strategy at the moment. And that is required to work the numbers backwards. We will be finalizing the defense strategy in the next 3 to 4 months, and then we will work the numbers backwards. But also going into government expenditure, I know it does look extravagant most of the time, but if you take a regional number, we are at about 20% of GDP. This is still lower than most of our peers in the region. This is not to say that we are not going into expenditure control. Of course we are, and I think ST will probably be the best to respond to this. But but those numbers by itself are not going to help us to come out of this. But it will be a really feel-good factor for the people. It will give people more confidence when we do that.
Thank you. And I trust there is also a plan that is being put into process to communicate these matters to the public, which I believe is one of the biggest drawbacks of policy at the moment.
Adam, I will just
Ali?
also, before the ST says, overall, if you look at it, there is also misperception and also about the communication. 70% of our budget went for payment of capital and interest out of last 7 billion. 70% went for payment of loans, capital and interest. And if you look at the government expenditure, including parliament, ministers and everything, as a percentage of the budget is 0.07. 0.07. So you reduce that doesn't mean that you are going to change the whole thing, but you still have to do it. But there are problems with us. Our public service is 5.5 million, which works out to 1 for 60. In India, 177 to 1. In Pakistan, 144 to 1. In Bangladesh, 117 to 1. In other words, Sri Lankans, 16 of us have to pay tax to maintain a public service. Whereas in India, 177 has to pay. That's a problem. We need to look at it. I think perception about it. There were cases when when government was offering graduate training to them, there were girls and boys who were well employed in the private sector with 200,000 salaries, willing to give up that and come and get this government salary for 50,000 rupees. About the perception, at 22, 23, they are looking at about their pension. No, as a percentage, this is a problem. We all have to work together. If you look at the percentage of Vietnamese into entrepreneurship, is about 16 to 17%. In Sri Lanka, it's just 6%. So people are not willing to take risk. So we all need to work together to create that perception. And one area we have been bleeding is about this SOE reform. I'm good that every one of us are in the same page that SOE reforms need to take place, but it has to be transparent, agreeable. So that's what I think everybody is working on. It has to be transparent, open, competitive, and it should be on the public domain. And so it's good. For example, I think we have called for EOI to build a refinery in Ambantotta. The minister put that all 7 EOI, these are the guys who have brought in. So some are giving the perception that it is ministers' companies or something. It's not. So we have called for EOI, people have applied for it, there are 7. Out of that 7, people are giving about that's good. So people are now, that is because it is in public domain and Google searches are also available, people are going and looking at it and saying, these are the companies. So one way of reducing that is also going for SOE reforms. So we have to, I think, some or other pursue that across the party line. I think what happened in India after the 1991, parties have changed. BJP had come, and we all know BJP's policies diametrically opposed to the Congress policies. In between, there were leftists also a coalition. But from 1991, more or less, they have continued the same economic policies. Unfortunately, we have not been able to do that. In 2000 government, President Wickremesinghe, he probably withdrew the pension in order to reduce the attractiveness of the government service and push them to the private sector. But the next government came in and reintroduced it. So that's why it's important across the party line, we have to have some sort of agreement. Despite the government changes, these economic reforms and policies must continue. So it is in that sense, I think a lot of actions have been taken, but communication need to be good, it has to be consistent. Parties must work across the board and across the party line to see it through. So I would also ask Mr. Sirivardhana if you can just give what are the specifics we have taken to reduce it.
Let's hear that from Mr. Sirivardhana and then move on to Dr. Harsha De Silva.
Just to make a comment on the expenditure, yes, I fully agree with the fact that, if you are basically raising the revenue, we have to spend all these revenues in a responsible manner. So we have taken that very seriously, especially from last April, almost 1 year. I have been there in the Ministry of Finance. I can assure you that we have been very careful in allocating expenditure as well as issuing imprests to particular expenditure items. I don't know whether you know about that. In fact, I have previously indicated in several occasions about the revenues that we are getting. It's around 160, 170 billion for a month. But out of that, we spend almost 93, 94 billion to pay the salaries, and another maybe 30, 35 billion to pay the pensions and the samurdhi, and another maybe 7 to 10 billion for the payment of medicine. So you are left with maybe around 20, 25 billion to do all the other things. Capital, be it the capital or interest payments and various other things. For interest payment, we would be basically, reissuing some of the instruments, but this is the status of the expenditure, at least during the last 1 year period. But if you see the entire numbers, entire yearly numbers, as indicated earlier, it's around, previously 20% of GDP, which is, compared with the peer countries, it's not that high. But last year, due to our, these serious efforts, it has come down to around 18.5% of GDP, which is a very good achievement in terms of, revenue expenditure management. For example, the other goods and services, which is the key items that could have leakages in general, it has come to around 0.% of GDP. But the only factor that went out of control last year is the interest payments. It's about 6% of GDP previously, but it increased to 6.5% of GDP. It is because of that. In fact, if you take the non-interest expense, that's the primary balance. In fact, under the IMF, it was only 4%, but we ended up with 3.7%. We overperformed the primary balance target. But that 3% of GDP is also as a result of the 1% of debt that was given to the CPC. In fact, they didn't paid it back, because we lent about 700 million US dollars. It is about 252 billion, which we got through the Indian line of credit. CPC did not pay us. We included all this into our accounts. So as a result of that, primary balance ended up as 3.7, but if not for that, we would have ended in 2.7%. You can imagine, within 1 year period, about 300 percentage point increase as a result of this effort that we have taken. But at the same time, these things achieved as a result of very strict control and also the monitoring. We issued number of circulars, starting from, I think, April 26 last year. And we issued specific circulars to the government line ministries and also state-owned enterprises. And we, stopped recruitment. We stopped most of the activities. Stopping these, some of the capital expenditure will have an impact on the growth. But you have to prioritize the actions that you are basically, taking in a situation like this. Don't forget that we are in a crisis right now. Still we are in a crisis, because I am the person who is seeing all the numbers almost every day. You don't know the effort at the Treasury, especially the Treasury Operations Department, is making to ensure that government payments are made on time and we are not going to collapse. So that's the situation. This is not a normal situation. That's why I'm listening to some of these comments. I see that in a normal situation, those things would be okay. But you have to prioritize, and you have to take some of the actions which may not be taken in a normal times. But since we are in a crisis situation, we will have to take some of this decision. So that's my broader comment on that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Harshadi Silva, you had an observation to make.
Yeah, I just want to mention to Sabri that, we have always been in this position, right? Like Ranjit just accepted earlier on. The political ideology was different. We have always been in the position that we are currently also and into the future. And if you sort of go through the blueprint that our party tabled in Parliament, it is very much consistent with what the President said in terms of reforms. But we believe in a social market economy where, on the one hand, while we have to work with markets, we believe in markets, we believe in competition, we also believe in social justice and equity. So these are things that we need to fine-tune. But ideologically, I must tell you, we are aligned. Now, he talked about two reports, the Shenoy report of 1966. That was defeated because Dadi Sennaike thought that J.R. Jayawardena was going to unseat him. That's an internal matter. Because the Shenoy report wanted the rice subsidies taken out. right? And he thought the rice subsidies taking out would mean what happened earlier in the Hartal, and that he may have to be unseated. But the Gok and Swi report, I think in 1978 or 79, somewhere there, both referred to fiscal dominance of monetary policy. See, that is the thing we really need to understand, because I just looked at the numbers in the IMF appendix. Interest alone for 2022 was 89% of tax revenue. Interest alone. So if you add capital, that is coming to about 140% of tax revenue. So where are we going to cut? Sure, we spent a bunch of money, 950 billion or something in salaries, half of that for the forces and the police. There's some amount that we can perhaps save in by cutting capital expenditure and all of that. But fundamentally, the elephant in the room really is the interest on debt. So unless we move ideologically from where some of the political parties were and some still continue to be, to what we have been sort of professing for a long time, we cannot get out of this problem. For instance, let us look at the idea that the Jayasundaras and the Lakshmans and the Cabrals professed, where they said, look, let us cut taxes and let us get the central bank to finance the expenditure. That we very vocally criticized as modern monetary theory at the time, which no country, not even America now we see with the inflation rates in the US, hitting 40-year highs, was not sustainable even in a country that, had their own currency and borrowed in their own currency. So it was never possible here. So one thing we must understand is taxes need to be collected by the state, because the expenditure now, what we incur, is actually not enough. We have to spend more. We have to cut in certain areas, but we have to spend more in other areas, right? So in that context, we have to at some point become sustainable, where we run perhaps a small deficit, if at all, but certainly run the surplus on the primary account, so that we can sustain this thing, right? So ideologically, we must come to the agreement that this has to balance, and taxes must be fairly in line with what we spend. So that's the point I want to make.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was fairly clear in your perspective on this. If we can move to a related area of transparency. Mr. Harsh Fernando from the Bar Association, you're here representing them today. Any thoughts on how we can, increase the aspect of transparency in government dealings, in government expenditure, in SOE privatization? And if we can also link that up with the entire area of the talk of SOE privatization, we have almost 100 billion rupees being, 1,000 billion rupees rather being spent and lost by the combined forces of the CPC, the CEB, the Sri Lankan Airlines, Airport and Aviation Services. That bleeding needs to stop, and stop now. We're talking of privatization, but we're talking of privatization of the more profitable assets, Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation, for one. Your thoughts on transparency, including that aspect, please.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think we can take transparency as a standalone issue. I think transparency is just one of the elements in your overall anti-corruption drive. So I think one of the things that we see that could be improved is minimize the separation between anti-corruption and decision-making. You sort of tend to keep it as two things. No, it has to be merged into one. So if you follow proper procedures, if you go according to the laws, if you follow proper procedures, and the decision-making is done the way it should be done, broadly we call it governance, then transparency will automatically come. But I think the bigger issue in terms of transparency is, I think you spoke a lot about tax revenue, and people are very upset about the loss in disposable income because of taxes, professionals included. But what is our connection to the public financial management processes of this country? We don't have any bridges to know that. Somebody makes a decision, and we are takers, and the bill is given, now pay for this. Even if you look at, for example, the Auditor General's report, it finally goes to the Parliament, but it doesn't get connected to the Bribery Commission, or to the Indian Revenue Department, or to the FIU, or to the Public Service Commission to deal with errant officials, or to the Auditor General's office, where you can ask them to pay the loss that they caused because the decisions officials made that were wrong. So that we see that a systemic approach to deal with anti-corruption together with these reforms is not taking place. So even, I think now the anti-corruption law along the lines of UNCAC, United Nations Convention Against Corruption, is being drafted. But I think we all know that there's a big difference between having a pristine statute
and the implementation.
And seeing it implementation on the ground.
Exactly.
Now, for that to get implemented, everybody who is linked in the process, there has to be a change in their attitudes, increase in their capacities, the way we approach. If you look at not only the IMF, you look at the UNHCR, for the first time, anti-corruption, bribery, recovery of stolen assets has come to the center stage. Now, those are the pressure points that we as a country is facing. So we need to bring it to the center stage and deal with those. So decision making, so transparency alone, I think is a very narrow way to look at the issue. I would rather say you look at it as a broad governance, which includes anti-corruption, proper decision making, public financial management, transparency.
Okay, very, very quick question on that. I know you're only representing the Bar Association here, not the President. Do you see a role for the Bar Association to be a watchdog in this regard? We've seen the Bar Association play a very prominent role as a watchdog of people's rights over the last 2 years. Do you see a role in the transparency operation as well?
I think, I mean, I wouldn't say, although I'm
very quick response.
Although I'm representing the Bar Association, they did not tell me what I should be saying. But having said that, I think as lawyers, we do play a significant role in terms of accountability. If you look at most of the cases, during the crisis, after the crisis, before the crisis, a lot of things were challenged. Even Honorable Sumandiran, in his capacity as a lawyer, has challenged a lot of those things. So I think we have got an opportunity to play that role, provided we are retained. Now, for us to get retained, there has to be that public need to hold government's decisions accountable. And that will come with more openness, more information, engagement with the public. So that is the role that we say. It's not only for lawyers, but I think for accountants. I think our laws are very clear that we shall not participate in any deal that has a corruption element in it. Our professional ethics prohibit it. So I think we have a big role to play.
Thank you.
Not limit it to the lawyers.
Thank you, Asha. I'm going to speed this segment up because we're just about 10 minutes away from our closure time. Mr. Vish Govindasamy, you've been quiet right through this thing. You head the chamber as chairman of the Chamber of Commerce. This area of state-owned enterprise, how much of a concern is it to your chamber, to you as a businessman as well? And what do you see as the way forward in the SOE privatization and SOE reform?
Thank you, Adam. First of all, I would like to thank the President, the State Minister of Finance, and the Ministry officials for getting this IMF program on the road. As a Ceylon Chamber, way back in 2019, as soon as the COVID hit, we were the first ones to actually go to the Finance Ministry and say that this is the opportune time to go to the IMF. We hadn't defaulted then. We had all the opportunity of getting it right, but unfortunately we were shoo-shooed off. But maybe this is where we are today. And for SOE reform, and I think that's the key, it's SOE reform, and sometimes we use the word privatization and everybody gets excited. There's a lot more to do before privatization. I think the Honorable State Minister talked about the hospital that people are thinking it's for sale. It's not about selling, and I think it's about reform. And I think Minister Kanchana this morning explained to the Ceylon Chamber of the type of reforms that he has done at CPC and he hopes to do at CEB. And we are all very grateful of what he has done at CPC. We have fuel in this country now. So there was no selling of any assets or anything like that, but it's a better way to run these organizations. So there are things where government is not supposed to be doing businesses. Unfortunately, there are lots of resorts and hotels and restaurants and various things which government in some form or another has got in. So those are things that they need to get out of. Now, SOEs also have gotten into the form of subsidizing. We cannot continue to subsidize. I think the years of subsidies are out the window, right? We have to make sure, and I think the members of the opposition talked about the socio-economy. We need to look after the vulnerables, right? But that doesn't mean giving handouts. How do we make sure their livelihoods are better? So I think SOE reform is a huge subject, and I'm happy that there's an office that has been created now. There's a DG who's looking at it. And the last week we saw some announcements of some of the big ones that we are losing colossal amounts of money, mainly because of mismanagement. Mainly because of mismanagement, because if you look at our neighbors, they have something called the Navaratnas, the 9 SOEs, right, that brings the biggest amount of revenue to the country. They're called Navaratnas, right? So doesn't mean just because you're SOE that you have to lose money and you have to be mismanaged and you have to be, they don't have to be privatized and belong to private sector management. They can be well run, right? And they have to be, you talked about transparency, right? Lot have to be put on open, books have to be open, boards have to be appointed properly.
That's right. Doesn't that have a lot to do with the appointment of the people who run these organizations?
I was just about to say, the boards, we cannot have friends and family in the boards of these SOEs. We have to have professionals, people who know the business to run this SOEs. So hopefully, I think we have come to the era of this type of thinking, and hopefully this will get done. And we from the Ceylon Chamber are fully supportive of this kind of reform, and we will not hesitate to call out where if things are not going the right way in the reform sector.
Yes, Mr. Govindasamy, I think the Ceylon Chamber has a huge responsibility to also play a watchdog role especially in the constitution of the boards of management of these SOEs, because ultimately, incompetent people in charge of these organizations, these are large businesses, and they have to be run as such if they are to serve the economy in any way. Mr. Haushafran, you wanted to make one more comment before. You might have to speed this up.
Is that, you see, the question that I'm asking is on a different matter. Is our legal system good enough to give us the competitive advantage that we are seeking to get in the current strategy that the government is employing? Simple thing to attract the dollars. I don't think our laws have gone through a revision that needs to be done. And even in the strategy that appears to be taking place, we see there's a lot of room for coordination. Changes in law in one area has to be complemented by changes in laws to another area. So due to the lack of coordination today, speaking for as a private legal services provider, an investor finds it extremely confusing. Leave aside anything.
Land ownership law, for instance.
Not only that, investment laws, your exchange control laws, your company registration laws, they change overnight. Uncertainty and lack of predictability drive away investment. So whatever the reforms program the government takes place must have a very clear coordinated strategy with the legal framework, and not only the laws that are in the books, but the gazette regulations, the plethora of laws that never really leave the statute books when they come on it.
Thank you. The Honorable Kanchana Wijesekara, I wonder whether you have a comment to make about your reform of the CPC and what we can expect in the CEB as well. I mean, these are the two primary drainers of our economy.
I would say we have done a lot of work in terms of the petroleum sector reforms. One thing is to make it more efficient. Cost-reflective pricing formula was one initiative that we had to do, cut off subsidies so that we don't overburden the treasury. So we did the same thing on the power sector, electricity sector as well. The CEB reforms is something, actually Harsha is also part of the committee drafting the legal framework for it. So we are hoping that we'll have the draft act in Parliament maybe by the end of May. The President will announce the roadmap for the energy sector reforms and the policy. What we hope to do is, I think it's very similar to what Iran, Harsha, your SJB blueprint, in your economic blueprint for the energy sector has outlined as well. Competition in generation, competition in distribution, power wheeling, those sort of options to be given. So we're well on our way for the unbundling process to take place. CPC2, what we've introduced with 3 new suppliers into the retail market is to have a healthy competition. I think attracting players like Sinopec, United Petroleum, Shell with RM parks, those will be massive investments and give a massive confidence to the other investors as well. I would say the IMF program brought that confidence. IMF program brought not just the confidence and the money, but also that stability to the banking sector. Because even until now, we are unable to do any procurement through letters of credit. So I'm sure with the program coming into effect, we'll have better suppliers, we'll have the financial assistance of letters of credit, more banking facilities. So with that, we will have better suppliers coming into the market. So we hope with those, of course, we are planning on doing a human resource audit on both SOEs to identify excess or whether there's a deficit. So we need to find that as well. And also the renewable energy roadmap. President will lay it out in May. We've done a lot of groundwork on that, on clean energy, green hydrogen, climate change, all those things taken into consideration. And the most important factor would be in this transformation, I would say the cost-reflective pricing for electricity is a challenge that we have done, but it had laid the groundwork or the foundation for more renewable developers to take part. Ability to CEB to pay back is one important thing that we did with the cost-reflective pricing. So with that, we hope that 30% thermal power could be converted immediately to renewable energy, which will drive the generation cost down. Because in terms of electricity pricing, 86% is on the generation cost. So we have to drive that down. For that, we are ready to do that when the President announces his roadmap in May.
Thank you, Mr. Wijesekara. We are very pleased to hear that. And we hope again that the results of this restructure will be transparently available to us with clear targets for achievement, and that those targets will be monitored and achieved. Many of the questions I'm asking are actually questions that have come in also from the audience. So even though I'm not reading them out as questions, I'm taking the gist of it for the benefit of those of you who feel that your questions may not have been addressed. I'd like to get into one last area very quickly. And, all this we've talked about raising ourselves from the abyss is dependent on the people that we have in this country to take this task forward. Now we have Ali Ashik from Sluscom, an IT sector that has the potential to be the number 2 foreign exchange earner in this country and is already at number 3. And we also have Mr. Ken Vijayakumar from the Sri Lanka Institute of Personnel Management. The impact of the brain drain, how significant is it for you? We've seen this in every company. I don't think there's anyone here in the audience whose organization hasn't faced a massive exodus of staff over the last year. How significant is it for your industries in particular? What steps do you urgently recommend as an immediate measure to try and rectify this problem, because we seem to be losing the best amongst us? Ashik, if you will take the question first and then perhaps Ken.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as you rightly said, we have close to about 145,000 people working in the sector, close to about 83,000 focused on the export side of this. And these are people who earn fairly high income, and with the dollar depreciation, the high inflation, etc., that was coming, that came to fore last year, this industry actually pivoted into those and increased wages quite high. So it was not really the loss of income or an income reduction or anything that is leading to the brain drain. It's, I think, also not about opportunities, because this is an industry where demand outstrips supply. So companies are ready to hire talent wherever they may come from. The main question is about the middle layer, which are people who have young families, where they see where this country is heading to, whether there is hope for their children. So it's a much more bigger picture and confidence, as Mr. Sharadamalino spoke about, at the individual level, whether they would want to remain here and build a future for themselves. I think that will, with all these coming, all the reforms and the IMF support facility coming, and the economy improving slowly, that would reverse over a period of time. But as a messaging, as a communication, I think we need to improve a lot from the government side and from the industry side about the positivity, the opportunities here. But it has definitely affected, because when the middle layer leaves, it's very difficult to build new talent into the industry. And much more difficult is where we need to attract more investments from outside as well. This is a sector where the global demand is constantly rising. And if you look at some of the countries in the region like India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, this sector is becoming a significant part of their GDP. Sri Lanka has the potential to do that. I mean, this sector has grown almost 13-14% CAGR throughout the last 20 years. It has the great potential, and it's a very low-hanging fruit because there are no market access barriers, so to speak. There are no tariff or non-tariff barriers. Any Sri Lankan can go and sell this to any part of the world. You don't need free trade agreements or any of this nature, right? We are virtual. So essentially, this is a very low-hanging fruit for us to grow exponentially. We just need to retain the talent, and that will come from a lot of macro factors and a lot of positivity being put out.
Thank you. Ken, your quick observation from you, please.
See, I represent the larger part of people, See, we are members are people managers, the HR managers of the companies. The current problem is, as you said, the professional brain drain, which is about 30 to 40% currently every company is facing. So there are a couple of issues connected with it. One is to retain them. How do we going to retain? The other one is for the existing employees, they're asking for pay hikes because of the disposable income being reduced. Can the companies give those pay rises? It's difficult because then the cost of production will go up, and then they are completely nervous. We are in the export industry and your price will go up. So it is actually a real a problem for all the HR managers or people managers in the country, because ultimately it will come as grievance to the HR department. So how do we look at this? And from the government, they need to give, as Mr. Amalian correctly said, give the confidence for them to stay back. How this will be, we can turn this around. How can we look at the tax structure? We can, sort of revise little by little in the future for them to come and work here, stay back, because many professionals are planning already to migrate to many other countries, and because they come to our HR managers and ask for letters of, confirmation, their work experience letters. So every day now, our focus is more on giving letters and references rather than, looking into the operations. The other thing is, one last observation now, see, now as, we get people from the society. As politicians, now, if you are going for rebuild the country, it's a change management. What is the message the politicians should give to the society? One of the electorates, they were like the crackers for the IMF loan. So, but they must educate. No, all of us get together, we must build the country. right behavior, in sustainability, in consuming resources, use renewable energy. This has to start from the top to the bottom. So that's how we can build the country. Otherwise, only this discussion will not work. We must have a proper plan to take this country forward. Thank you.
That's an important point for the Honorable Mr. Ali Sabri to take note of for his team. I'm going to have to wrap this up because I've also been getting signals from our compeers, Savitri, and the organizers. Is there any final comment that anyone would like to make on this before we close up? Anything left unsaid that needs to be addressed? If not, I'd like to thank the panel, His Excellency in his absence, and everyone else here. I'm not going to take you all by name. Thank you for your presence here, your participation in the free and frank discussion. Oh, I'm sorry, we've left out a colleague from SLIM. He was actually talking to me earlier on about national planning. I think a comment on that, national branding rather, I think a comment on that might be useful to close up. You have already made a proposal to the state, or you initiated action last year, if I remember, through SLIM, to look at a national branding campaign. What has come of it? What is the result of that? What's happening on that?
Yeah, actually, we did a comprehensive study about understanding the country's soft power index, where we are going to stand. So when you look at from the last year to this year, so there's a greater fall when it considers Sri Lanka. It was 74th position last year. Now we are at 115th position. So that because of the political, economical, and social issues that we faced during the last year. And my humble request, because Honorable President's two senior advisors are here. So actually, if you look at some of the countries like Bahrain and even Singapore, those countries are having separate unit for nation branding. Nation branding is something actually putting all the BOI and Export Development Board and the Tourism Promotion Bureau together and approach in one line. So you can sometimes convert your tourist. Today tourist can be converted as a tomorrow's investor. So we are actually proposing that kind of approach to Sri Lanka. I think our launch pad, Dr. Harsha and Mr. Iran was there. So we are focusing on that. So when times to come, we will bring our proposals to the government and all other relevant parties. Thank you very much.
Since your comment was on branding, and I find that we have panelists that we haven't even questioned. My apologies, Ms. Faisal from the Sunday Times, and you're in charge of the financial unit. But of course, this is to do with an area of media and national branding. Would you have any comment that you'd like to make on that? We also have the head of the Hotels Association here, who have problems of their own. Perhaps we can hear a minute from the two of you before we wind up.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very interesting point that he made in terms of, and there has been a debate going now, I think, in the tourism industry as to whether we should call it Sri Lanka or Ceylon, and whether there should be one branding that covers all sectors. But beyond that comment, I would like to ask a question. You know, I wanted to ask this from the President, but I didn't have the time. Maybe Mr. Ratnayaka can respond. I mean, in this whole process, there is a saying called, there is no gain without pain. Now, what pain would the public, the public have to undergo during this process of reforms? I mean, what are the difficulties that people would have to face?
Okay, got it. I think the President spelt it out quite a bit in a few deliveries that he made. One was in Parliament during the interim budget, followed up with the budget, and then again in March, on the 6th of March, I believe, he laid it out. It's going to be very difficult. I think the fuel pricing formula kicking in and us having to pay the real price for fuel, the cost-reflective electricity coming in, the inflation hitting, and the cost of living going up. And on the other side, you have the taxes kicking in, and your final take-home packet reducing. You've got, so...
Shrinking.
Shrinking, yes. And these are all pains. And at every level of society, this pain we will have to go through. I must say the worst in terms of uncertainty is over, but the worst is still not over. We still have a few more months of this, but already we are seeing a trend of the rupee strengthening. This will vary. I mean, once the import restrictions are lifted gradually, this will have some fluctuation and it'll steady off at a certain point, and the policy, once it kicks in, also will make it independent. But that, together with inflation coming down, has seen some of the prices coming down. Then you also get the benefits of the cost-reflective tariffs, the fuel pricing formulas when the currency strengthened. We saw the minister already making an announcement about the fuel prices yesterday. We had to bring it in 3 days early because the shed owners were not replenishing stocks, not the city ones. The city ones, the turnover is very high, but it's when you go outstation, they take a load, it sits there and goes down gradually over 5, 6, 7 days. So they didn't want to take the hit. And these are issues that we will face. But also there are checkpoints for that. I'm digressing from your point, but there are checkpoints. There are laws which say a shed owner has to maintain a minimum reserve. So I think the minister is writing to them and reminding them of that, that they could lose their license for not complying. But so it's started turning, but it's still going to be a difficult time. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. We've started seeing the light. Like everybody, I think I've heard it a few times over, comms has been very bad. We also need to make note of your point that there has to be some branding of the country and overall branding. Right now, we depend on tourism to do it for us, but that's a tourism branding, not a country branding. It's not for business, it's for leisure. So we depend on the BOI to do another on the investment side. But we need to work that out, and I'm sorry I don't have the answer or the solution right now, but we'll make note and start working on it.
Thank you. And we shall excuse Mr. Ratnayake because he's indicated to me that he's half an hour behind his next appointment anyway. So state business calls, please. Just one question, one comment. Thank you. One comment from the Hotels Association representative, Mr. Hettigoda, I believe is your name. Thank you. We are sorry we didn't accommodate you up here, but please.
Thank you, Adam. At least tourism gets a few minutes, even though tourism will be the largest foreign exchange earner by 2030. Our prediction is that we will reach about $10 billion. And I think I must mention the importance of that. Considering the economic situation the world is going through, tourism is certainly, according to the president also, is a low-hanging fruit. However, I think we have serious problems in positioning Sri Lanka as a high-end tourism destination. We don't really have proper standards. We don't require tourism stakeholders to register, to maintain quality levels. And also, His Excellency mentioned about green economy, sustainability. We have a great opportunity to make all the hotels sustainable, renewable, based on renewable energies. I think some laws we want to discuss with the Minister Kanchana. And also mentioned about no global campaign. Sri Lanka has not had a global marketing campaign for 10 years. And how do you expect to get there? I mean, these are things that we need to fix quickly. Lastly, I must say that for 4 years, tourism has suffered from Easter Sunday to COVID to economic crisis. There are many SMEs who are struggling. The President mentioned that. And I hope the Secretary to the Treasury and the Central Bank will seriously look at least giving some breathing space for these SMEs, because their debt has accumulated to levels that even if you operate at 80-90%, you will not be able to pay. And as you know, historically our highest occupancy rates are between 60 to 70. So these are some of the concerns, and I think the government must look at tourism in a serious manner if we strongly believe that tourism is going to be the #1 industry in this country.
I think there's something to add to that in the form of the very recent trend and a very scary trend of a tourism mafia forming here within the framework of Sri Lanka in certain regions, with the low-end travelers forming themselves together on long stays and setting up business which is counterproductive to the industry and counterproductive to the country as a whole. I think those are matters that the state also needs to take awareness of. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again for your presence here and the audience for your participation.
Thank you so much to our ministers, our members of parliament, representatives from the chambers and professional bodies, as well as our moderator for